So I got a lot done on the Mustang here, even though it looks pretty much the same as it did when I started. But took the full exhaust off, took both headers off, because when I put this engine in, I forgot to remove the broken studs on the exhaust bolts, and there was like 2 bolts holding each header on because I knew I had to take them back off to do that. There was 3 broken studs, 2 on the driver, 1 on the passenger. So welded nuts to them, pulled them off. There's those. Put new gaskets in here and put ARP exhaust manifold bolts on so they will not snap off again. Did it on both sides. It was kind of a pain with it in the car. Should have pulled those out while I had it on the stand, but you can see all the ARP bolts down there. So I did that. The next thing I did was, because I had the whole exhaust off, is I heat wrapped everything. So as you can see, that's heat wrapped. This is heat wrapped over here, and all the way underneath is all heat wrapped. And then one more thing I did was I added a flex joint in the exhaust right there underneath the middle of the car, because there's a V-band here, there's a V-band there. This thing, the stock, I don't know, however this manifold hooks to the stock exhaust, which is off the Chevy truck, it moves, it can move. So that flex joint allows you to not have to have everything so perfectly lined up to get the exhaust back together. Works great. Both the V-bands are in. So that is that. You can see the flex joint down there. So exhaust is on the car. The only thing that should ever have to come off again in the near future is this, because this is going to have to get cut off. Well, the turbo flange onto there, but this piece is really easy to take off. It's 1 V-band, 3 bolts, and it comes right out. As long as you don't move anything else, it'll go right back in the same spot. So that's good. As far as that is it for today, and we'll work on it another day. Alright, working on the Mustang again here. So what I'm doing today is, this is the entire engine harness for the V6 that used to be in the Mustang. The reason I'm even bothering with this thing is because I want all the stock gauges to work in the car. And the way that I'm going to do that is I left the stock Ford computer in the car, and I'm going to hook this back up with the sensors that I want, so the Ford computer thinks it's running an engine, but it's not actually running an engine. It'll make the oil pressure work, the temperature gauge work, the RPM gauge, and the speedometer also is somewhere in here. I did label everything when I took it off to make this a lot easier, because it is pretty hard to find wiring diagrams for the V6 Mustang. Not a lot of people do stuff with them. So yeah. Alright, so got the harness all stripped down. So this right side is everything that is not needed anymore, and then everything on this left side is what we're keeping. So we have crank sensor, water temp sensor right here, oil pressure sensor, we have the AC clutch control, the AC line pressure sensor, and the 2 transmission sensors. One of these is reverse, one of them is for the tach on the gauge cluster, and that is it. Everything else, I have it here for now. I haven't taken it out yet because I want to double check, verify that there's nothing else, but everything else, all of this gets completely removed. This block will stay with whatever's needed. This goes to the fuse block. This plug goes to the computer. This plug goes to the computer. This plug goes to the car, and this plug is our key crank starter signal, which will plug into the car, and that's already hooked up to the engine, and it'll work. We'll have our clutch, key clutch safety, neutral safety, all that stuff. So gonna go get this in the car, verify that everything works, and then I'll cut all that out. Alright, so we're back on the S197 LS Swap Mustang here again, and what we're working on today is a continuation of the wiring. So I'm working on the Mustang wiring to get all of the factory stuff working on the dash inside. What I'm doing right now is I've taken out, as I showed before, all of the factory Mustang sensors that we will be integrating onto the LS engine. So we got crank sensor, all the AC stuff, oil pressure, temperature, and then I also took out the throttle body, because every time I turn the car on, the little screen on the dash would say fail-safe engine mode, because obviously the Mustang computer wasn't happy because there's not a Mustang engine in here. So what I did is I figured out that if I hook the throttle body up, so the electrical side that actually moves the throttle body, the sensor, and then if I hook the factory gas pedal back up underneath the dash to the harness, you turn the car on, it'll energize the throttle body, you'll see it do its little test thing, and that message goes away on the dash. So that will be plugged in, hidden somewhere down there where you can't see it. The factory gas pedal will be plugged in underneath the dash, up out of the way where you can't see it, just so that, you know, that's the only way I know to keep that message off of the screen. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and chopped off all of the sensors that we won't be using. So that's all this mess here. You can see the pile of all the plugs for all the sensors we're not using anymore. What I'm doing is I'm pulling all these wires back to the original Mustang plugs. I'm pulling all the wires that I cut off, and I'm depinning them from the Mustang plugs, so it'll almost be like they were, you know, pretty much never even there. There won't be any cut wires. They'll just be taken out of the plugs completely. So what I have is this little depinning tool. So basically I'll find the wire, I'll pull it all the way back through here, and then this little guy sticks in the back of this plug, releases the pin, you pull the pin out, and here's all the ones I've done already. So these are the pins that go in the back of the plug. So they're completely removed. You can see all the openings I've already taken wires out of. So I'm going to do that with all these wires. Then the only thing will be left is this little bundle of sensors that we'll be using. And once we get to there, we'll start figuring out where we're going to mount oil pressure sensor, where we're going to mount our coolant temp sensor, and go from there. Alright, so we got everything we needed depinned. So as you can see, put the air filter back on just temporarily, but I got all kind of sorted together here. We got our branch coming off here going to the throttle body, and then our other branch with all of our other sensors. So next step, clean this up a little bit because we got some cut off ground and stuff, so get rid of all those cutoffs, and then start putting these sensors on the LS. So I think what I'm going to do for like the coolant temp sensor, we're going to put an inline like what we got down there to splice the hose, but put one up here so we can thread that Ford coolant sensor in. That'll give us our coolant temp on the dash. We also got to hook up our oil pressure sensor somewhere. I'm thinking ICT Billet sells a little block that goes on the side of the oil pan where the factory LS oil coolers go on the trucks. And that's going to be our oil feed for the turbo right here. And it has 2 ports on it. So the second port, I'm going to thread in the oil pressure sensor, the stock Ford one. Plug that in. That's our oil pressure. And then the only other things is we have reverse lights. We have a tachometer signal somewhere here, which we got to figure that out still, and the crank sensor. But we'll start getting those figured out and we'll go from there. All right, we're working on the Mustang again here today, and what I'm working on right now is trying to get the factory tack on the dash working with the LS. So what the problem with that is, here is the factory Ford crank sensor which feeds the tack. And the issue is the LS sensor is a 3-wire Hall effect sensor. The Ford sensor is a 2-wire variable resistance sensor. It's a magnetic. It creates a magnetic field. So the Hall effect sensor, I believe, has a square wave. This has more of like a sine wave. So I can't just hook them together. That won't work. So what I'm doing is I have to create a Reluctor wheel on the LS for the factory Ford sensor to read. So basically what I'm going to be doing is what I'm going to try to do is I have a spare power steering pump pulley. So what I'm going to do is the factory Ford Reluctor wheel is a 36 tooth Reluctor wheel, but it's missing 1 tooth. That's so it knows the position of the engine rather than just the speed of the engine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my other power steering pulley, and I'm going to cut a whole bunch of notches in the front to match what the Ford Reluctor wheel had on it. And I'm going to mount the crank sensor somewhere here, and that should give me, hopefully, an RPM on the dash. I understand that it won't be exactly the right RPM because the power steering pump pulley is slightly smaller than the crank pulley, so it'll be a couple hundred RPM high on the gauge cluster in the car, but I'm not too worried about that. So I'm going to try to get that going. As you can see, here's the other pump I have. It's an old power steering pump. This pump is dead, but it has the same pulley. It's actually off an OBS Chevy, not even LS, but I believe they are the same pulley. I've gone ahead and marked out all my marks, and I started cutting just a little bit there, but I'm going to cut all these notches in here all the way around. Right here where this arrow is, that's where the missing tooth is going to be. So it should have the same number of teeth as the factory Ford Reluctor wheel that was on the balancer of the V6. I'm going to cut these in here, pull this pulley off this pump, pull the pulley off that pump, put this pulley on that pump, which is a pain because they're all pressed on, but whatever. And then figure out how to mount the crank sensor and start it up and see if we have a tack. Alright, so I've got the pulley ground down here. We got 35 teeth, 1 missing tooth here. I just did a grinder ground them all down, cleaned up all the edges, and now I just went and tested. I stuck this on the drill. I stuck the crank sensor in the door here, and I spun it up in front of the crank sensor while I was watching the tack, and I could actually see the tack move. So I'm going to try and set the phone up on the tack and spin this up, that way you can see it move. Then the next step will be put it on the pulley on the pump and mount this to the engine next to the pump. So this is a video of the tack. I'm going to spin up the new Reluctor wheel that I made on the pulley, and that way you can see what the tack does. Alright, so the power steering pulley is installed. I made this little bracket out of stainless steel flat bar. This is where the factory LS battery post, big red box, bolts to, which we don't have anymore, so I use those 2 bolt holes. Used a piece of flat bar, stainless steel, and bolted the factory Ford crank sensor to it. As you can see, that's where it picks up on the pulley. So now the only thing left is to start it up and see if the tack works inside. Theoretically, since it worked with the drill, there shouldn't be any problem. It wouldn't work now, but we're gonna see. Obviously the oil pressure light is coming on because the oil pressure sensor is not hooked up yet. So we got to get the coolant sensor hooked up, the oil pressure sensor hooked up, and then figure out the speedometer. And then all the gauges inside should work.